Stephen Mark invited me to do this, he did actually give me really quite a wide scope. Basically, kind of just tell us what you do and what you're getting on with was basically the message that I got. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically involved in these two kinds of activities, as Stephen Mark said at the beginning. So I'm going to do this presentation in two parts, one coming at it from the very global kind of perspective of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then I also want to talk much more specifically about what's happening with Just Transition Scotland. And the way I sometimes put it, with IPCC, my head is in the clouds, with Just Transition, feet are firmly in the ground. So it's quite a nice combination. So there was a big IPCC report came out this summer in August from our colleagues who work on the physical science side that got the kind of the Code Red for Humanity headline to go with it. And I think there were three big messages that came out of it. It's absolutely unequivocal, the first time that IPCC had used that word, that climate change is caused entirely by human influence. Second message, that we can see the impacts of that climate change already, and we've already seen extreme events this year, which we can now say would not have happened in a world without man-made climate change. And the third kind of big message is that the kind of the targets that were set up in the Paris Agreement and returned to at the Glasgow COP will not be achieved unless there are immediate and deep reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases. So very powerful messages coming out of that report. Now, unfortunately, the report I'm working on in Working Group 3 is in preparation. It's just been sent to governments for them to look at. So I can't actually talk about it at the moment. It's due for approval by governments next March. But I can talk about the last big IPCC report that's talked specifically about emissions and holding warming to that kind of Article 2 of the Paris Agreement level. And just to say, when we produced that report on global warming of 1.5 degrees 3 years ago, it wasn't because we thought of doing it. The Framework Convention, in the Paris Agreement, there was a specific request for IPCC to produce this report with two homework questions. What are the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees? And what are the kind of pathways for emissions you would need to follow in order to limit emissions to that kind of level? So this isn't my area. I don't work on climate impacts, but it's worthwhile reflecting on what the conclusions were on impacts. And what our colleagues who were working on that report did was to create this so-called burning embers diagram that shows you that the colors show you the intensity of the risk associated with particular kinds of impacts and systems. So the axis on the left-hand side shows warming above pre-industrial levels, going up to 2 degrees and above. And the grey bar shows where we were between 2006 and 2015. In fact, the report that came out this summer says we're about 1.1 degrees warming now. We're getting ever closer to that 1.5 level. So you can see the tropical corals on the left-hand side. We can already see the impacts. They're dying off at current levels of global warming. But if you were to ever get to 2 degrees warming, we would pretty much lose all tropical corals. Ice-free Arctics is an issue. At 2 degrees warming, you get an ice-free Arctic about once a decade. At 1.5 degrees warming, once a century. And there are other kind of risks in which we're very conscious. Coastal flooding, for example, where you can see significant differences between the impacts of warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees. So a strong message. It actually matters a lot what limit you're able to hold global warming to. And just to say, at the moment, we are really not on target for meeting, these kind of the kind of objectives. The report we had, I'm just checking where we are here. This is slightly out of sequence. This is basically to say from the 1.5 degrees report what pathway emissions would need to follow to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. That's global carbon dioxide on the left-hand side. And basically it's showing there were about 100 scenarios in the literature at the time. There are more like 2,000 now that show how you can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And the big message is you need to reach net zero emissions by around the middle of the 21st century. There's quite a lot of uncertainty around the precise time. But more emphatically, you do need to reduce emissions substantially by 2030 within the current decade if you're going to be on the pathway to 1.5 degrees. So the key number was 45% reductions from current levels by 2030. So dramatic cuts and then moving on the way to net zero by 2050. It's not just carbon dioxide emissions, there are other greenhouse gases as well. So for example, methane emissions, which come from fossil fuel infrastructure, coal mining, and also from agriculture, mainly rice paddies and cattle, they would need to come down as well. They're certainly not to zero. And at the bottom right, nitrous oxide emissions, which come mainly from fertilizer application in agriculture, would also have to come down during the 21st century. So all greenhouse gases need to come down, and not just carbon dioxide. And the order I should have had it in is to show just what progress we're kind of making at the moment with respect to that 2030 level. The NDCs are so-called nationally determined contributions that are basically the pledges that individual governments make under the Paris Agreement. You add them all up, and this is the picture that you get by 2030. So basically, even the most recent pledges, which have become increasingly more ambitious, and they are making a difference, are not enough to bring emissions down. So much the same level of emissions in 2030 as in 2020. And as you can clearly see from the graph on the left-hand side, that's certainly not enough to put us on a pathway to 1.5 degrees. Now, the other thing that we picked up is very relevant for anybody in the energy side is that there is more than one way of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, or indeed well below 2 degrees, which is in the Paris Agreement. So we picked out in this report 4 kind of illustrations of different kinds of pathways for emissions that could limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And just a quick explanation. The dark blue line is net carbon dioxide emissions, which can go below zero, obviously. The grey area is emissions from fossil fuels and industry. The orange part is emissions or sinks from agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and these can act as sinks as well as sources of emissions. And the yellow part is rather more controversially the technology bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So very different pathways there. And the contrast is basically on the left-hand side with pathway 1, you're looking at very rapid emission reductions in the near term. And I should say that's about 5 or 6% a year, which is as much as the decline we got in a single year for COVID in 2020, but accumulated for about 20 years into the future. So extremely demanding. With the pathway up the right-hand side, you more or less wait till 2030. That would still be compatible with the nationally determined contributions. But the price you pay for that is that you then need to take lots more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere later in the 21st century to get you back to that level of 1.5 degrees warming. So really quite a challenging picture there, and neither of them, in a sense, is that attractive a scenario for moving for different kinds of reasons. And just to say, again, this will be in the report that we produce next March, the kind of issues there. But on the right-hand side, it shows you from the International Energy Agency some of the kind of milestones that you would need to reach in order to get on a pathway to net zero by 2050 and roughly 1.5 degrees. So just a few examples. By 2030, 60% of global car sales would need to be electric. We would need to be getting about 1,000 gigawatts a year in annual solar and wind additions to electricity systems. And the unabated coal would need to be completely moved out of electricity systems in advanced economies. And so it progresses into the future. So by 2040, for example, half of the fuels used in aviation would need to be low emissions. There would need to be net zero emissions from electricity globally. and a complete phase out of all unabated coal and oil-fired power plants. And by 2050, more than 85% of buildings would need to be zero carbon ready, and about 70% of electricity globally would need to come from PV and wind. So really very, very dramatic changes. And these kind of dramatic changes obviously have big social and economic implications, which brings me to kind of the second part of the talk, which is about the work of the Just Transition Commission in Scotland. And there's no agreed definition of just transition, but what we on the Just Transition Commission took it to mean was that it's about governments designing policies in a way that ensures that the benefits of climate change action, and there are benefits, are shared widely, while the costs don't fall unfairly on those least able to pay or those whose jobs are at risk when the economy changes. So that was roughly the definition we took. And we started about the beginning of 2020, just under 2 years ago. And the mission was to provide practical, realistic, affordable recommendations for ministers to help them maximize the economic and social opportunities of a net zero economy, build on Scotland's strengths and assets, and understand the risks and how that come from the kind of the transition, and to understand how that these could be mitigated. So the way we work, this was not an academic exercise. The members of the Commission did not, by and large, come from academia, although I was chairing it. We had people from the trade unions, we had people from environmental NGOs, we had people from business, and we had people from community action groups. And there were, in fact, 3 academics, including myself on there. So it was a wide range of stakeholders that were involved. And the way we acted, at least until lockdown came and we had to resort to Zoom meetings, is that every meeting took in a different place in a different part of Scotland where we addressed a specific issue. So top left-hand corner, our first meeting was at the Coalfields Regeneration Trust in Kincardine, where we looked backwards at the closure of the Lungannock Power Station on the social and economic implications there, and thought about the development of the electricity system. Bottom left-hand corner, we were talking with farmers down in the borders about the challenges they faced from conversion of land from agriculture to tree planting, some of the big issues around land tenure in Scotland, which is a major issue and touches on climate change. Bottom of the middle at the bottom, we're talking with professionals from the oil and gas industry at the Oil and Gas Technology Centre in Aberdeen, getting a feeling for how they saw the transition away from oil and gas towards a different kind of energy economy. And top right-hand corner, of course, we were actually visiting the Grangemouth refinery to talk about industrial aspects, but we thought this was much more photogenic when we went off to Falkirk to see the Kelpies afterwards, a fine example of economic regeneration and diversification. So that's the idea. We got out and about. We didn't sit in offices in Edinburgh and Glasgow, like in the bottom right-hand corner all the time. In terms of the scope of just transition, in most countries in the world, it has been about how you get out of the coal industry. But of course, for Scotland, coal is in the rear view mirror, and therefore that's not an issue anymore. We need to think about the oil and gas sector. But we thought it's not just about the supply side, it's about the implications for people as consumers who may bear some of the costs. And it's also very important to think about communities, local government. The importance of place is extremely important. And we're also emphasizing the kind of the opportunity a bit, because Scotland, like every other country, is full of existing injustices. And we picked up areas around land tenure, fair work, and energy poverty, which the transition to net zero actually provides us with a chance to address some of these challenges. So throughout our 2 years' work, we actually produced 3 reports at the end of the day. At the beginning of 2020, I'm trying to remember it all now. We produced an interim report where we produced our special thinking, and then the governments then also asked us for advice on a green recovery in the middle of 2020, which was a very fast report that we produced. So the Green Recovery Report, which came out in the middle of 2020, these are some of the recommendations we came up with. Try to reconcile a recovery from the COVID crisis with a net transition to net zero and with the ideas of just transition. On 3 areas that we picked out as priorities were investment in warmer homes, because energy efficiency in homes is a triple win, lowers emissions, reduces fuel poverty, and can reduce people's energy bills as well. A second one on backing buses and supporting the supply chain. Scotland's a big manufacturer of buses. We were concerned about the implications of COVID on faith in public transport. And the third one was about the question of maintaining and creating new jobs for oil and gas workers. I used to say we've picked up many issues around there about the ability of people currently working in the oil and gas sector who could be involved in decommissioning, who can be involved in offshore renewables, can be involved in carbon capture and hydrogen projects as well, to move over. And that was really what we were thinking about there. The final report, which came out in March this year, we had 24 recommendations in all. And to make it a little bit simpler, we grouped these 24 recommendations into 4 different themes. But each of these 24 recommendations, many of them were quite specific, and they were intended to be that kind of realistic and practical flavour that ministers had asked for. So our first theme was about pursuing an orderly and managed transition, because as the example of the rundown of the coal industry in Scotland, it was a few decades ago, unorganised transitions, unplanned transitions tend to be unjust. So it's really important to plan for it. So the government has in fact followed up on that, and there will be a set of just transition sector plans and an overall just transition planning framework to do this, so that people understand where you're going to go. Second thing is the question of equipping people with the skills and the education they need to benefit from their transition. And this reflects both skills development in mid-career to help people move over from one sector to another or move sideways within a sector. And there is, in fact, a climate emergency skills action plan that the government has already put in place to help with that. But just to say, it's very important that the universities and the colleges also help to build the foundation for that with early years education as well. Third one on empowering and invigorating communities and strengthening local economies, and a variety of different recommendations there that really referred to getting things closer to people. So things like green budgeting for local authorities, with consultation with local communities about the way that budgets are spent. The fourth one, and this is really critical, is basically the money issue. How are the benefits shared, and making sure that burdens are distributed on the basis of ability to pay? And there we get into issues like fuel poverty, but also the issue that a lot of the cost of decarbonisation so far has fallen on electricity consumers. And many people have no choice but to use electricity for heating their homes. And piling all the costs of decarbonisation on that group of people is certainly not fair. So we would like to explore different ways of distributing the costs of decarbonisation, especially with the view that we might be going towards expensive heat pumps, for example, rather than gas-fired boilers. We're also concerned there about issues like the move to electric vehicles and how that may affect people in rural communities and how that is actually handled. So these were the 4 areas of our recommendations. And we are actually very pleased with what the Scottish Government came up with. It said that it was going to agree with all of our recommendations. So we now have a Minister for Just Transition, Employment rather than Employability and Fair Work. It's Richard Lochhead, who actually led off in a debate in Holyrood yesterday in the Scottish Parliament about that. We have a just transition planning framework. We have sectoral just transition plans, which will start off with the energy sector, and work is already underway on that. We have a Green Jobs Workforce Academy, and we have a Green Jobs Fund. Worthwhile saying, there's also been a big a big sum of money allocated to help with the transition in the northeast of Scotland, which obviously will be affected by the rundown of oil and gas. And as Stephen Marks said at the beginning, there is also a new phase of the Just Transition Commission, and the process of making the appointments is currently being made at the moment. So currently I'm still the only member, but the jobs that we will have going forward are scrutiny and advice on the Just Transition plans, thinking about ways of monitoring and evaluating progress towards just transition with suitable indicators, and continuing with the approach we took in the first part of the Just Transition Commission to have meaningful engagement with different communities and get round the country. And just to say, we will be reporting and producing an annual report that just basically gives our views on the progress being made and whether government is doing all that it needs to do. So I have to say I've pretty well raced through that, but that was my last slide. And I'd be very happy at this point to just respond to any questions or comments that people